So our arteries are defined because these are the vessels that carry blood away from the heart. So as I mentioned before, they're usually drawn in red because they also mainly always carry oxygenated blood. So almost always. Can anybody think of an artery that would not be carrying oxygen-rich blood? Carrying it away from the heart? What are the two circuits of circulation that we have? We have the systemic, which is the body, and then where does it go out to?
The one that goes to your lungs.
The one that goes to your lungs, yes. So arteries that are carrying blood to the lungs are O2 poor. So pulmonary arteries. The other one only occurs when you're a fetus, and that would be the umbilical artery. So the umbilical artery is fetal, and so it is trapped taking blood to the placenta where it's going to pick up oxygen-rich blood. There's actually no blood traveling out to the lungs. And so that would be, I'll put also the umbilical artery in the fetus. So arteries are capable of like expanding, and then they also contract against the flow of blood. And so they will tend to have a pulse, right? So they have a pulse. So you probably have heard of, like, if you cut an artery, one way that you can tell that it's not a vein is it will actually squirt the blood out. So it'll go squirt, 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 right? And that's with every heartbeat, the blood is being pumped out of the artery. And that's a really bad thing, because a vein, it will just flow out slowly, but continually, right? So arteries have pulses. They also have lots of smooth muscle. So they are able to constrict and dilate. And this constriction and dilation is called vasoconstriction. So think vascular constriction. And so this would decrease the diameter, and this would decrease blood flow. Because blood, like any other fluid in a system, is going to want to flow the path of least resistance. So it tends to decrease blood flow, vasoconstriction does. But it also, when you constrict the blood vessel, it also increases blood pressure. Right? So you can sense this when you have a hose and water is just trickling out a little bit, and then you cover half the hose opening with your thumb, and then all of a sudden you have lots of pressure, right? And so vasoconstriction will cause an increase in blood pressure. So the opposite of vasoconstriction is vasodilation. And this is where we increase the diameter. And this tends to increase blood flow. But it also decreases blood pressure. Vasodilation. So when we're talking about the shunting of blood to different body parts, say when you're exercising, the blood vessels that are taking blood to your muscles are going to dilate, and the blood is going to travel to your muscles in order to deliver oxygen and nutrients. And then when you're exercising or you're in the fight or flight mode, the blood vessels that serve your guts, your stomach, are going to constrict. And there's going to be a decrease of blood flow to your digestive system when you're in fight or flight. And so this just allows for shunting of the blood to different parts of the body, right? So, for example, when you're cold, blood is shunted away from the skin and it actually starts to look pale or blue, right? And that's just because you're trying to conserve heat. By shunting blood away from the surface of the skin, you're not going to lose as much heat to the environment. So those are the arteries. The other vessels that we have are veins. And by definition, they carry blood back to the heart. Mostly carry O2 poor blood. Except for the exceptions stated above, right? So except for above exceptions, like the pulmonary. There's exception two in the sentence. Sorry, there's two exceptions in this. Okay, sorry. Except for the above exceptions. Okay. So except for the pulmonary vein and the umbilical vein. So the pulmonary vein and the umbilical vein actually carry O2 rich blood back to the heart. So in the veins, the blood is at lower pressure. Right? And the veins have only a small amount of smooth muscle, so they're not very muscular. So to keep the blood flowing up against gravity, for example, when you're standing, the blood has to come up your legs. The valves have, or excuse me, the veins have valves. And this prevents backflow of blood. So I mentioned before that sometimes people have a problem with this and that the blood pools in their legs and that can lead to blood clotting. So the other thing that the veins do is that they tend to be associated with skeletal muscle. So they're associated with skeletal muscle. And this helps when you move, it helps to pump the blood back to the heart. So movement helps to move the blood. Right, so getting up and walking around will help to get the blood out of your legs. So if you're standing in one place, getting up and moving, walking. And then you could also do compression stockings, right? We mentioned that before, because that's going to put pressure on the veins and partially constrict them, and that will help move the blood back up. So sometimes people have damage to these valves, and then they get what are referred to as varicose veins. Right? And it's kind of interesting. Some people are predisposed genetically to having lots of varicose veins. So like if your mother or your dad has them, you're more likely to have them. But sometimes they can become really big. And so you can see in some people's legs, it almost looks like their veins are knotted in their legs. And so they can actually go in and surgically remove those veins, and the blood will get picked up by other veins. And so you can remove some of those veins and it doesn't cause a lot of problems. So they're not just a problem aesthetically, like they make your legs look not good, but they're also a problem because it just allows the blood to pool. And wherever blood is pooling, it can lead to clot formation, right? We talked about that clot, the embolism, right, is a clot that breaks free and can travel to your lungs, your heart, or to your brain, okay, and cause all kinds of problems. Okay. So if we look at, in your book, they have some diagrams that show the difference. And so notice that the smooth muscle layer is much thicker in the artery than it is in the vein. And then also notice that the vein has these valves. So when blood is pumped, or not pumped, when it moves up, right, it comes up, and then if it were to come back down, it would actually close that valve. So it's a mechanical valve. So if blood moves up through the valve and then comes back down, it will actually close it. And so it'll keep the blood from going too far back into the system and not up towards the heart. Okay. So in a closed system, we have to have a mechanism for exchange with the tissues because all of our cells are bathed in fluid. And this fluid is referred to as interstitial fluid. So we need to have what are called capillaries. And capillaries allow for the exchange between the blood and the interstitial fluid. So what this word technically means is inter is between. So between the tissues, okay? So this is the fluid that is just not in the circulatory system and is just found bathing each of the cells in your body. So if we look at a diagram of a capillary, this is my diagram, and leading into the capillaries are what are called arterioles. So an arterial is just a very small artery. So in this diagram, they show it. This would be my arterial on this end right here. So this is my arterial. Okay. So it's leading into my capillary. This is actually showing a capillary bed. So the capillaries, you want to think of them as not just a single, they're generally a capillary bed, which is a multi-branching structure. You can see that the blood goes out into the tissue and then it emerges back and then is picked up by the veins. Okay, so I'm just going to draw one of these little capillaries here. And this is my venule. So this is my arterial end and this is my venule end. And it looks like I forgot to put the I in there, but for some reason they omit the I. Okay, so that just means vein. It's a very small vein. Okay. So blood coming in at the arterial side is under high pressure. So we call this hydrostatic pressure. High, right? So the capillaries are very leaky. And so if the blood is coming through at a high enough pressure, it will cause things to leave the capillary. So at the arterial end, we have oxygen moving into my interstitial fluid, right? We have nutrients like glucose or amino acids moving into my interstitial fluid, okay? Now at the venule end, and we also have water. So at the venule end, instead of the hydrostatic pressure, which would be like the pressure that was created by the pumping of the heart, we have pressure that is going to suck stuff back in at the venule end. And this is called osmotic pressure. So I'm going to put high osmotic pressure. And this has to do with solute concentrations on the inside of the capillary. So we have a protein, you don't need to know the name of it, but it's called albumin. We have a protein in our blood that creates this osmotic pressure that actually sucks stuff back into the capillary at the venule end. So the hydrostatic pressure is lower, but we have this high osmotic pressure. So we have carbon dioxide coming in. We have urea, which is a waste product that is going to be put into urine. Right? And then we have water being picked back up. And this is really important that the water gets picked back up because if it doesn't, then you get tissue swelling. You get edema in the body. And that swelling can cause all kinds of problems. And if it doesn't get picked up, if the excess water doesn't get picked up by the capillary, it will be picked up by the lymphatic system. So we talked about the lymphatic system when we were talking about nutrient absorption. But the lymphatic system will also pick up excess water, okay? so I'll put that down here, is the lymphatic system, which is always drawn in green, will pick up the excess water lost from the capillaries. Now, some of you might be familiar with tissue swelling as it relates to like allergies. So like right now, my nose, like my sinuses are all swollen up and I can hardly swallow, and my ears, my eustachian tubes are all blocked up. And that is because of a chemical called histamine. So histamine is actually a chemical that is produced by the body in defense. And it is a chemical that causes the capillaries to become very leaky. So it causes capillaries to become more leaky. And the reason for this is that if I have a virus or a bacterial infection, I'm hoping that white blood cells will actually leave the capillaries and go out into the tissues and hunt those viral infected cells down or my bacteria down. And also just flushing it out, right? So it causes the capillaries to be more leaky. And so this causes tissue swelling. As an immune reaction. Okay, so I'm fighting off probably a virus. Okay? And so you can take antihistamines and you'll breathe better, right? So if this is an allergy, right? Allergies are an immune reaction to something that is not dangerous to your body. And we talked a little bit about allergies and asthma when we were talking about hookworms, because it's the same part of the immune system that fights off parasites that is involved in allergic reactions. And so what happens when you have an allergy, like I have an allergy to grass pollen, and so all the grasses are pollinating. So I breathe it in, and my body detects it's in my system, and so it'll start to produce white blood cells that are specific to that, and it'll also release histamine. So I'll get all stuffy nosed, and my eyes will itch, and my throat will itch, and I'll have an allergic reaction because of the production of histamine. Now, there is a danger of having an allergic reaction that is too severe. And does anybody know what is it called when you have like a massive allergic reaction and you almost die? Anaphylactic shock. Okay. So when they give you like vaccines, which could cause anaphylactic shock, they always are ready for it, right? They're ready for this allergic reaction. And then some people carry around, you know, if you have children, it's really good to have antihistamines like Benadryl, just in case something happens, right? In case they have an allergic reaction, like to shellfish or something that they've never eaten before, or to a bee sting. Sometimes this can cause a massive release of histamine. Right? And it can cause excessive swelling. And the most dangerous place where swelling occurs would be where? Throat. Right? So if I take penicillin, my throat swells up. So I have an allergy to penicillin. So every time I go to the doctor, my files have these big red X's over them. Not give this person penicillin, because it causes my throat to swell up and I could die if I can't breathe, right? And it also lowers blood pressure. So much water leaves the circulatory system that you have too low of blood pressure, which is actually called hypovolemic shock. You don't need to know that, just your blood pressure goes really low. And so what do they give you, or what do they recommend if you have a child? What is it that you carry around in case of anaphylactic shock? EpiPen. And what does the EpiPen have in it? And this was in the news because some guy was trying to make them super expensive. You know, it was like $600 for an EpiPen when it should not cost that much, you know, $20 worth of drugs in it. What do you think it has in it? It has a chemical called epinephrine. What's another name for epinephrine? Adrenaline. And so what this does is that this causes vasoconstriction, right? So the blood vessels constrict. The heart rate also increases, right? But this vasoconstriction, this will boost blood pressure, and it will keep the blood going to the brain, right? You want to put them down so that their blood has an easier time getting to the brain. So you lay them on the ground and then you give them the EpiPen, and then that will boost the blood pressure so that enough nutrients and oxygen will get to the brain so that you don't go into a coma. So that's what an EpiPen does. This also increases heart rate. Okay. So that is capillary exchange. If we look at, already talked about blood pressure. I'm going to skip over that. Talked about capillary exchange. There we go. So this is the picture. And so in this picture, you can see the capillary bed, and you can also see the green structures. Those green structures are lymphatic vessels. So remember, the lymphatic vessels contain water, but they also contain other things that could cause, you know, maybe they pick up bacteria or damaged cells. And so they travel through your lymph nodes on the way back to the circulatory system up near your neck. And so sometimes if that becomes clogged, it can cause big swelling, like we talked about in elephantiasis when we were talking about the nematode, the filarial worm, that causes gigantic swelling in the body. But under normal circumstances, our lymphatic system works pretty well, although you can aid it by doing what they call lymphatic massage, right? So you can actually do some simple massage techniques to get the lymph to move more quickly through those. Because unlike the blood, there is no heart pushing the lymphatic fluid, right? The lymphatic fluid just flows real slow. And it's got to come up, and it's, you know, everywhere in your body. So it's got to come through these major checkpoints in your armpits and your neck, and then back into the circulatory system. Okay. So let's talk about cholesterol and health. So when we talk about bad versus good, we're actually not talking about cholesterol itself. So cholesterol is all the same. There's no such thing as a bad cholesterol or good cholesterol. It has to do with the lipoproteins that transport the cholesterol. Okay, so cholesterol is a lipid, right? And as a fat, it is not water soluble. So it actually has to be packaged with these proteins in order to be transported in our blood. Now, why, does anybody know what kinds of things do we use cholesterol to make? Why do we need cholesterol in our body? You remember? Why might we need cholesterol? Cholesterol, oh, go ahead. It's not in the bones. It's, Well, actually, it does have something to do with the bones. So the cholesterol is a lipid that is a precursor to vitamin D. So that's how it links. So vitamin D is necessary for bone development because it's necessary for calcium absorption in your gut. Okay? So you can actually convert vitamin D in your skin. When the sunlight hits your skin, it can convert cholesterol to vitamin D. It's actually a type of photosynthesis that we are capable of. But it is also a precursor to testosterone. That's an important hormone, right? And estrogen. So the upshot is that we need cholesterol. We don't necessarily need to get it in our diet, but we need to find out what causes cholesterol to build up in our blood vessels and cause problems. And that's where the bad versus the good comes in. Okay. So we have two different types of cholesterol, and they are called high density, not cholesterol, but lipoproteins, high density lipoproteins. Okay. So this is HDL. Okay. And I always think that this should be the opposite, but HDL is good. I'm thinking high density, that should be bad, right? It's dense, but that is actually the good molecule. And then we have the low density lipoproteins. So the LDL, and this is the bad. So if we look at why these are, it has to do with how they transport cholesterol from the liver to the tissues. So this is the liver on one side, the tissues on the other. Okay. So LDL takes it out to the tissue. So I'm going to put LDL. And if it's out in the tissues, then it could cause problems, right? It could clog up vessels. If it is coming from the tissues back to the liver, this is HDL. Okay. So that's why that is good, is because it stores cholesterol in the liver where it can be useful, but it's not causing problems. And so the interesting thing is that a lot of this is predisposed genetically. Like I have high LDL and HDL. So my cholesterol, they say, is bad. My cholesterol levels are bad because I have high LDL. And so they might want to put me at some point in time on a cholesterol that they can put you on drugs called Lipitor, right? But that has bad side effects. And so some things that you can change the relative composition is through diet, but also exercise and the lack of smoking. So smoking increases your LDL. Lack of exercise also increases your LDL. So there's environmental as well as genetic components to having this. And so as you get older, they do blood tests and they come back with these numbers about your relative LDL to HDL. And they'll tell you that you either need to change your behavior or everything's fine, or that maybe you need to go on drugs to reduce the cholesterol, the LDL in your blood. Has anybody ever had their cholesterol levels, quote unquote, cholesterol levels checked in here? Are you guys all too young for that? Yes. So does he have bad cholesterol?
All I know is that he has to exercise.
Yeah.
Watches for these.
Yeah.
Which I do that for him.
Yeah. Yeah. Make sure you get lots of exercise. Okay. So when we look at what this could lead to, we have a disease that is called atherosclerosis. And this is where we get plaque buildup. It's not the same type of plaque buildup as your teeth, but you have a plaque buildup in the walls of the arteries. Okay. So this plaque contains cholesterol. Okay. So it can cause blockages of blood vessels and or rupturing. So if you have high LDL and you're having some symptoms like your shortness of breath, so that suggests that maybe you're not getting enough oxygen out to your body, they might do what is called a stress test. So they put you on a treadmill and they make you walk. I haven't had to have this done. So they make you walk and they measure your heart and your breathing. And if it looks like your heart and your breathing are not able to keep up with your exercise, then they will do what's called an angiogram. So they'll actually look at the blood vessels, and specifically, they'll look at the blood vessels that serve the heart. So, for example, these are what are called the coronary arteries. So these are blood vessels that provide the heart with oxygen and nutrients. There's also veins, they're called the cardiac veins, but the coronary arteries are a problem because they're the ones that are most susceptible to atherosclerosis. Okay? So if you look at what this looks like, okay, so this is the normal artery, this is the plaque with the plaque, and so what sometimes happens is that these plaques can become unstable. So what can happen is that you could be, you could maybe not even have any blockage, but if you have an unstable plaque, it could just like all of a sudden one day rupture. And if it ruptures, you can have a massive heart attack and like die at the age of 50. So people that like just keel over of a massive heart attack at age 50, it's most likely that this is what was going on in the coronary arteries. Okay? So this is the plaque. And notice that it's actually in the wall, but it can rupture out and block the flow of blood. So what do they do if you have these blockages? What can they do? Anybody know? What do they actually do to unblock? Yes. So you can put a stent, right? So you can, so options are, is you can put a stent in the blood vessel to open it up. Oops, in the blood vessel. Okay, so this is like a wiry mesh. So you can stick it in there and it'll pop open, and then it'll prevent the clot from closing up and preventing it. But if it's too bad, one of the things that they can do is they can do what are called bypass surgeries. And so, you could have a single bypass, you could have a double bypass, you could have a triple bypass, you could have a quadruple bypass, right? And so that just describes the number of times they have to go around a blockage in a coronary artery. And so they go around that blockage and they generally use a vein, and they harvest veins from the leg. So they'll open up your leg, take out a vein that's not like you don't have to have it, right? They'll take it out and they'll use that and put it where the artery needs to bypass it. And then it'll kind of turn into an artery over time, right? So if we look at an example of this in a diagram, this is from the internet, but here you can see if there's a blockage right here, one of the things that they can do is that they can just take the single blockage and just take that oxygen-rich blood right to that area of the heart, right? So they bypass it. So that's the aorta, the red diagram or the red vessel that's coming out, and that's oxygen-rich. And so notice that they're taking this vein and they're bypassing the blockages and reconnecting it so that those areas of the heart will not die. So you can have minor heart attacks that cause some muscle cells to die, and then you can keep having minor heart attacks over time. And if at some point the heart just gets so weak that it can't do any pumping, then you have congestive heart failure. And then you have to maybe go on a pump. We talked about that left ventricular assist pump, or you just have to have a new heart, right? So if they're too damaged, then you have to have a heart transplant. Okay. So today we're going to start on a new section, a new system. And obviously the respiratory system and the circulatory system go hand in hand, because the respiratory system is what gives us oxygen, and we get rid of the waste product carbon dioxide. So when we talk about respiration, this is the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Some organisms simply have this movement over the surface of their body. So for example, flatworms use their surface of their body as a respiratory surface. Okay. We obviously have a very complex respiratory surface and system, and the reason is that we are not aquatic, we are terrestrial, and so we have to have a system that is going to conserve water. We can't have just, we can't breathe. We do breathe a little bit through our skin, but that's not, we can't have a wet skin, right, and be able to just breathe, because we would dehydrate, right? So we have to have a system that takes the air to the inside of the body. So if we look at the requirements, okay, you have to have thin, it needs to be thin, it needs to be moist, and it needs to have a large surface area. For the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So requirements for gas exchange. Yes, thank you for, okay, so the requirements for gas exchange is that you have to have a thin membrane, it's got to be moist, and you have to have a large surface area. So the reason for this is that oxygen and carbon dioxide are not pumped, but rather they just simply diffuse. So gases diffuse from a higher to a lower concentration. So diffusion is just a passive process that we can even see like in a beaker of water, because when you add salt to it, the salt molecules will diffuse until they're equally distributed in that beaker. And gases likewise will diffuse until there's equal distribution. And so generally there's more oxygen in the air than there is in the blood that is going to the lung, so that the oxygen will diffuse from the air into our blood, right? So that's why oxygen poor blood needs to be the type of blood that goes and picks up the oxygen at the lungs. So if we look at some different examples of this, of respiration. So this is my marine flatworm, right? It's very thin. It has no circulatory system. It simply gets oxygen, and CO2 just moves passively across the surface of its body. And then we talked a little bit about arthropods, in the fact that they do not breathe through openings near their mouth, but rather they have these cysts, sets of tubules in their abdomen, and air will just go into their abdomen and diffuse and supply all of the tissues with oxygen and get rid of CO2. So notice the air is flowing in two directions. So those are openings in their abdomen. You can sometimes see those openings open and close. And they sometimes pump their abdomen too. If you're looking at a grasshopper, it's moving, it's kind of pumping, and that helps to keep the airflow through its body as well. Okay, so this is respiratory membranes. So we just talked about that. So we're going to go back to respiration in fish. Sorry, you don't need to write that down. Respiration in fish. And so when we were looking at the perch, remember that they had gills. So this is the bony fish. And what happens is that they have a gill covering called the operculum. And so they open their mouth and they close the operculum, which is the gill covering. Sorry if I can spell it right. Okay. So this is where water moves in to mouth. Okay. Then they close their mouth, open the operculum, and water moves out across the gills. Now you may have seen some some sharks. And the sharks sometimes will just, like those big giant sharks or cartilaginous fish, sometimes they just move through the water and their gills are open and their mouth is open and they're just going in and then out, right? And so here you can see that water and blood are actually moving in opposite directions. So the water flows over in one direction and blood is moving, should be in the opposite direction. Is that right? Water flow. Look at the next picture. I think that this is a wrong diagram. So water actually should move in the opposite direction of the blood. It's not a big point to be made, but so the water and the blood mix at the capillaries. And so notice that the gills are very thin. Notice when we were looking at the gills that they had kind of frilly edges. They're large surface area, right? And the gills are moist. So they have all of those characteristics of a respiratory membrane. Okay. So if we compare this to what we see in the vertebrates, the terrestrial vertebrates, we can look at the development of the lung in the amphibians and the reptiles. Now remember that amphibians have a thin, moist skin, right? So they use their skin plus the lung. And remember that the lung is a modification of the swim bladder, okay? Reptiles have just their lung, so lung only is the respiratory surface. So if you look at the amphibian, it actually has smaller lungs and it has less surface area. And also they actually have to use muscular force to force the air into the lungs. And that actually takes quite a bit of energy. So they essentially have to gulp their air in order to fill up their lungs. So it's like being on a ventilator, where you have to force air into your lungs to inflate them. Okay. So they have what is called positive pressure breathing. So they force the lung in, or the air into lung. That's air into the lungs. The other thing about terrestrial is that their respiratory membrane is on the inside. So it's deep inside the body. And so this is a characteristic of a terrestrial lifestyle because this helps to prevent water loss. Okay, so this is an adaptation for a terrestrial, which is land, lifestyle. Now, when we look at the aquatic mammals, they still breathe air, okay? So we'll put aquatic mammals still breathe air. Kind of as an aside here. So this would include like whales and dolphins, for example. Why do you think that aquatic mammals breathe air rather than having gills? There's a couple possible explanations for it. Where did they come from? They came from a terrestrial ancestor. So the aquatic mammals recolonized the oceans, right? So it could just be a constraint, right? That's what their ancestors had. Their ancestors had lungs. They didn't have gills. Right? The other thing is that it could be that if you have gills, you also are exposing your blood to the water, and the cold water will actually take away your body heat. And so by breathing air, these aquatic mammals actually retain body heat. Right? So they're not going to lose a lot of heat to the water as if they had gills. So gills would be a problem. They would be exposed to the water and the heat would just seep right out of them. Okay. So let's look at respiration in birds. So birds are endotherms. So you would think that they have to have a pretty efficient respiratory system, and they actually are more efficient than our respiratory system, right? So this is the most efficient system, I would say, and I think physiologists would agree, system. So it's better than mammals. And the reason for it is that it has a one-way flow of air through the lungs. So when we breathe in, air goes into this blind-ended sacs, and then we have to get that bad air or the dead air or the unoxygenated air back up. And if we're breathing really shallowly, sometimes that does not happen, and we might not be able to get enough oxygen if we can't breathe deeply enough, right? That happens in people with respiratory diseases. They can't breathe deeply enough, they just can't get enough oxygen, right? So this one-way flow of air keeps air moving through the lungs, right? So it's a more efficient system, and this is called parabronchi. So their lungs are parabronchi. So a bronchi is just a branch, and the air moves from one air sac to another through the parabronchi, and this is an efficient exchange because they have no dead air. So if we were to look at a diagram of that, it would look like this. So when they breathe in, they actually also fill air sacs, and that is actually an adaptation to flight. Because if you fill up these air sacs, then you're going to become more buoyant, right? You're going to become lighter, and you're going to be able to fly more efficiently. But notice that the air travels through the lungs in one direction, and then it comes back out. So these are the places of gas exchange. This is the respiratory membrane. So if we look at our respiratory membrane, it looks more like this, right? So it looks like this. So air comes in, right? And then it's got to get back out of there. And so it's not as efficient as that one-way flow. I'll draw that picture in a minute again. Okay, so let's talk about respiration in humans. and in mammals, but we're mammals, so we'll talk about it in humans in particular. Okay, so we have a nasal cavity separate from the oral cavity. And we do have these really cool sensory structures in our nasal cavity that allow us to detect odors, right? So we can smell different smells. And that is important because that is actually really intimately linked with our taste, our sense of taste. But we'll talk about that when we get to sensory structures in the nervous system. Okay. So one of the things that the nasal cavity does is it filters the air. So it's actually a really bad thing to be a mouth breather. Right? So if you just sit around breathing through your mouth and not through your nose, you're more likely to get stuff into your lungs that could be harmful. So if you can, even when you're exercising, you want to try to breathe through the nose, right? And that's kind of hard right now. But anyway, you can try to breathe through the nose. And it's kind of weird because sometimes when I'm in really dusty environments, like say, for example, I'm driving down a dirt road and there's a car in front of me, my instinct sometimes is to not breathe through my nose because I don't want to get all the dust up there. But it's actually better to breathe through your nose than it is through your mouth because you don't want that dust getting into your lungs, right? So it filters the air. It has mucus, right? So mucus and cilia catch the particles. Right? It also humidifies the air. So if you breathe through your mouth, you're going to lose more water out. You're going to breathe more water out, water vapor out. So when you're sitting in a car, for example, in the winter, and your windows fog up, that is moisture from your respiratory surface. You're breathing it out. You're losing water, right, in a dry winter. You can also notice this specifically if you have really dry heat in your house. So for example, if you have a wood stove, sometimes you'll wake up in the middle of the night and you'll be super thirsty. And that's because the air is super dry and you've lost a lot of water from your respiratory system. So then from the nasal cavity, it goes to the pharynx. And remember that the pharynx is the common opening. So it is before it branches into the esophagus and into the trachea. Okay. So from the pharynx, it goes into the trachea. Spells right, trachea. Okay. So the trachea also has mucus and cilia. Okay. So when you breathe in and it gets into your trachea, if you get particles in your trachea, the mucus will get collected, but the cilia actually moves the mucus up towards the throat. So we'll say that the mucus is constantly moving up towards the throat. And you swallow it. So even when you're not sick, you're producing lots of mucus, right? And so you can really see the effect of this in people that destroy their cilia. And how do people destroy their cilia? Does anybody know? What's something that you can do that will destroy the cilia and make you cough all the time? Smoking, right? So smoking destroys the cilia. So you end up with what is called smoker's cough, right? And the cough is just because you have to move the mucus by coughing because the cilia aren't there and they're not doing their work, right? So if you've ever lived with a smoker, they wake up in the morning and they hack and they hack and they hack. They have to move all that mucus that you moved at night unknowingly, right? They have to cough it all up in the morning, right? And so that's why it's really dangerous to take cough medicine just on a regular basis, because if you take cough medicine, then you could get mucus settling in your lungs, and then that could lead to things like pneumonia, right? So that's a bad thing. Now, the good thing is that once you stop smoking, the cilia will reappear, and then the mucus will start to move, and you can get rid of the smoker's cough relatively quickly after you stop smoking. Now, part of the trachea is the larynx, and so the larynx is the voice box. Larynx, there's an X there, an N and an X, larynx. So this is the voice box. And so our vocal cords are actually connective tissue. And when we exhale, air moves through the larynx, and then we can move the larynx, we can move those vocal cords open and close, and we can create the vibrations that will give a sound. Okay? So the vocal cords are located in the larynx. Okay. Then it branches into two bronchi. So we have the trachea, and then we have the two bronchi branching into the lungs. And then from these two bronchi, we're going to get smaller and smaller branches. Smaller and smaller. And these are what are called bronchioles. So small bronchioles, just like the arterial and the venule. Bronchioles. So that's CHIOLS. Okay. And then finally, we get to this structure, which is the blinded pouch, where actually the exchange of gases occurs. And what is this called? We looked at it when we were looking at tissues. We saw the smoker's lung, the pig lung in lab. These are called alveoli. And so this is where gas exchange takes place. So all of the rest of our respiratory system is just conducting the air. The only place for gas exchange is in the alveoli, okay? So the alveoli is the only site of gas exchange. Okay. Now we also have, I'm not going to talk about it today, but we also have a diaphragm. And the diaphragm is sometimes referred to as the respiratory muscle, but this is a muscle that aids in breathing, and it sits underneath the lungs. And it aids in ventilation. So we don't have to force air into our lungs. When that muscle contracts, air will just automatically move in. So mammals are the only organisms with the diaphragm. So this is only found in mammals. And this makes respiration more efficient, but probably not as efficient as what we see in birds. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for today. And we are going to be doing some circulatory, respiratory kind of exercising activities. And so there is the possibility of going outside. If you wanted to do the lab outside, you can do that. If you want to just do it inside and have your person go out and exercise and come back in to do the measurements. But my stuff is, you can unplug it and actually take it outside and do it, okay? So if you want to think about that in your group, whether you want to go outside